Harbor, December 7th, 1941. Hawaii. The first explosion shattered the calm like a hammer hitting glass. Without warning, the USS West Virginia shook from stem to stern, the deck pitching under a rain of metal. Men dropped their breakfasts, coffee cups smashed against the floor, and the air filled with the deafening roar of bombs. Outside, the morning sky, once clear and blue, turned black with smoke and flame. The Japanese had arrived. Below deck, in the galley, a 17-year-old boy named Tommy Reynolds stumbled as the blast threw him against the steel wall. The lights flickered once, then died. The smell of fuel and fire flooded the air. Pots crashed from their hooks. Boiling water hissed across the floor, and men shouted in panic. Tommy wasn't a sailor in the usual sense. He wore navy blue, but his hands smelled of soap and flour, not gunpowder. Months earlier, he'd joined the service full of hope, dreaming of standing on deck with the men who manned the great guns of the Pacific Fleet. But basic training had chewed him up and spat him out. He was too light, the officer said, too frail. The Navy didn't need another weak body clogging the lines. Someone had taken pity on him, though, and offered him a post as a galley assistant aboard the West Virginia. It was supposed to be safe work, cleaning, carrying trays, helping cooks feed hundreds of men a day. He'd taken it with a shy smile and a promise to prove he was worth something. Now the war had found him anyway. He could hear the guns above deck firing, the shriek of engines diving through the air. A second blast rolled through the ship, and the lights went red as backup power kicked in. Someone shouted that the port side was hit. Fire alarms blared. The galley crew scattered in every direction. Tommy grabbed the counter to steady himself. He could hear muffled screams through the bulkhead, men trapped, metal bending under pressure. The ship was taking water. But there was something else, too, the unmistakable sound of crackling fire. He ran toward it. The corridor outside the galley was already filling with smoke. The floor trembled beneath his boots. A pair of sailors were struggling with a fire hose, shouting over the noise, but the hose hung limp and useless. One of them cursed and kicked the valve. No pressure! The damn pumps are gone! Tommy's eyes darted to the pipes above them, the network of steel lines that snaked through every level of the ship. He knew them better than most. Every morning he'd use the steam system to heat water for the galley. He'd watch the engineers bleed pressure to clean blocked drains. It was a mess of valves and gauges that most men ignored, but he had studied them out of curiosity. Now that memory came rushing back. If the main water system was dead, maybe he could force steam pressure into the secondary lines. It wasn't regulation. It might not even work. But it was all they had. I can fix it, he shouted. The sailors barely heard him. One waved him off, thinking he was just another panicked kid. But Tommy didn't wait for approval. He turned and ran, back through the smoke, back into the galley that was quickly becoming an oven. The heat hit him like a wall. Flames danced across the cooking stations, licking at the ceiling. He could feel the sweat rolling down his face, the air thick with oil smoke. Somewhere nearby, a boiler had ruptured. He could hear the hiss of escaping steam. He climbed over debris, coughing, until he reached the small maintenance hatch behind the pantry. The valve wheel was glowing red. He tore off his jacket and wrapped it around his hands. His lungs screamed for air, but he forced himself to turn the wheel. It didn't budge. He gritted his teeth and tried again. The metal cut into his palms, skin blistering. Finally, with a screech, the valve gave way and turned. Steam roared through the pipes like a dragon waking from sleep. Above him, he heard shouting. Then, the sound of rushing water. The hoses were alive again. On the decks above, sailors cheered as pressurized water burst through the lines. They swung the hoses toward the flames that had been devouring the lower compartments. The fire hissed and sputtered under the sudden flood. Inch by inch, they drove it back. clearing a path to the trapped men in the engine room. Down in the galley, Tommy sagged against the wall, dizzy from heat and smoke. His hands were raw and burned, the sleeves of his uniform blackened and torn. But he didn't stop until he saw water pooling at his feet, proof that the system was working. Only then did he collapse. When they found him, he was lying beside the open valve, barely conscious, the bent handle of a kitchen ladle wedged through the wheel to keep it open. 2 sailors carried him to safety while the rest of the crew fought the fires into submission. Hours passed before the attack finally ended. The harbor was a sea of wreckage. Smoke curled from the ruins of ships that had once been proud symbols of the fleet. The Arizona, the Oklahoma, the California. Oil burned on the water, and the air was heavy with ash. On the deck of the West Virginia, wounded men lay in neat rows, some still dazed, others silent forever. Amid them, Tommy sat wrapped in a blanket, his face pale under the soot. His hands were bandaged to the wrists, and every movement made him wince. But when the chief petty officer stopped beside him, the boy managed a faint smile. "Was that you down there?" the man asked. Tommy nodded weakly. "Just did what I could, sir." The chief looked at him for a long moment, then said quietly, "You did more than most." For the rest of that day, the boy who had been called too weak for service sat among men twice his size and watched the sun set over a harbor in flames. The West Virginia had survived, battered but afloat, and many of her crew owed their lives to the kitchen hand who had refused to give up. In the weeks that followed, Pearl Harbor became a rallying cry for a nation at war. Newspapers listed the ships lost, the heroes made, the dead honored. But Tommy's name didn't appear anywhere. Officially, he was just another enlisted assistant in the galley. The log entry about his act was short, almost hidden between damage reports. Steam system rerouted by galley assistant Thomas Reynolds, preventing further explosion and loss of life. He didn't mind. Recognition wasn't what he'd wanted. While others were sent home or reassigned, Tommy spent weeks recovering in a hospital tent near the harbor. His hands healed slowly, wrapped in white gauze. Nurses came and went, sometimes stopping to ask about the fire, about what he'd done, but he never spoke much. He just smiled and said it was luck. One evening, as the nurses made their rounds, an officer in a dark blue coat stepped inside. He was older, his face lined with exhaustion, the insignia on his shoulder marked with salt and smoke. He stood beside Tommy's bed without speaking for a moment, then placed a small envelope on the table. "Reynolds," he said, "the board reviewed the reports. You saved a lot of good men down there. They wanted to make sure you knew that Tommy opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a single piece of paper, a commendation for bravery under fire. At the bottom, a signature, Admiral Husband E. Kimmel. For a moment, Tommy just stared. The paper felt heavy, unreal. "I didn't think it mattered, sir," he said quietly. The officer smiled faintly. "It always matters." After the war began in earnest, the Navy rebuilt, rearmed, and sent its men across the Pacific. Tommy could have taken a discharge after his injuries, but he refused. He stayed aboard, first as a cook, then as a supply technician, earning the respect of every crewman who served beside him. The same boy they once teased for being weak became the man everyone trusted when things went wrong. By 1945, when the war ended, Tommy Reynolds was 21 years old. He'd seen ships rise and fall, friends come and go, and oceans burn under the light of battle. Yet in every port, whenever someone asked where he had been when the war began, he would just smile and say, "In the kitchen." Years later, when he was an old man living quietly in Oregon, a historian tracked him down. The man had been researching Pearl Harbor's forgotten heroes, the ones who never made it into the headlines. When he asked Tommy about that morning, the old sailor laughed softly and said, "It wasn't hero stuff. I just did what I knew. you fix a pipe, you stop a fire. That's all. But the historian noticed something else. On the wall above his modest fireplace, framed carefully behind glass, hung the yellowed piece of paper signed in 1942. The ink had faded, but the words were still clear. For quick action and courage under attack, preventing catastrophic loss aboard USS West Virginia. Tommy never told his grandchildren the whole story. To them, he was just Grandpa Tom, the man who made the best biscuits, who never raised his voice, who always smiled when they asked about the war. Only when he died, decades later, did they find the medal tucked inside a small wooden box, along with the same bent kitchen ladle, scorched black but still intact. At his funeral, a Navy representative read from his record describing a young galley hand who'd turned steam into salvation on one of America's darkest days. The sailors who attended stood silently as taps played, the flag folded and handed to his eldest son, and though his name had never been printed in bold, his story lived on, passed quietly from one sailor to another, told in mess halls and training centers as a reminder that courage isn't measured in strength or rank, because on that morning in 1941, when steel burned and the harbor roared, it wasn't a commander or a gunner or a hardened veteran who saved West Virginia. It was a boy the Navy once called too weak to fight, a kitchen hand who refused to run, who saw pipes where others saw failure, and who used the tools of his trade to fight fire with steam. Tommy Reynolds never became famous. He didn't need to. His story became something rarer, a quiet miracle of war, the kind that hides between the pages of history but never truly fades. And in every ship's galley that came after, when young sailors faced danger and doubt, someone would inevitably point to the pipes above and say, "Remember the kitchen boy at Pearl, the one who turned a ladle into a weapon and saved a ship?"